Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Defense Rest Under the Legal Lens. I'm your host, attorney Rachel-Diane. And in this podcast, we like to break down criminal trials through the perspective and education of an actual practicing criminal defense attorney. We will analyze the tactics that district attorneys and defense attorneys use in trial, as well as the very critical decisions that judges make on motions and rulings that completely shape the outcome of a trial. We also analyze here the legal issues of police officers as well as Brady violations and everything in between. And for all of those that are listening through audio, if you want to follow along visually, not only do I put up pictures of the evidence while I'm talking about it and of the witnesses while I'm talking about it as well, but I'm also doing my makeup on YouTube while talking about this case. All of the makeup you can find in the link down below. It's from my own small business, Royalty Cosmetics. You can find it at www.myroyaltycosmetics.com. A portion of all the proceeds are donated towards sex trafficking victims that are now being prosecuted, as well as children in the inner cities that are now facing legal woes. And if you want to make sure that you never miss an episode of the Defense Rest, please make sure you turn on your notifications and follow either the podcast page or the YouTube page. We would love to have you be a part of this little growing family that we have going on. And with that, today, under the legal lens, the People versus Scott Peterson. The Modesto 911 dispatchers received a phone call in the evening from a man by the name of Ron Gransky, and he said,
"My son-in-law just called. My daughter has been missing since this morning. She is 8 months pregnant. She took her dog for a walk in the park. The dog came home, but with just the leash on."
His daughter was Lacey Peterson. On April 21st of 2003, Scott Peterson, Lacey's husband, pled not guilty to 2 counts of murder. The first count was first-degree murder for the death of Lacey Peterson, and the second count was second-degree murder for the death of their unborn child, Connor Peterson. Before we get into the trial phase that everyone knows about, we first need to get into something called motions in limine. Motions in limine are pre-trial motions and pre-trial litigation that happens literally the eve of trial. Motions in limine can be argued all the way up until 5 minutes before you see an attorney give their opening statements. Motions in limine are basically asking the judge to either allow certain evidence in or to keep certain evidence out. And both parties are going to file motions in limine. And these pretrial motions, these motions in limine, they will pretty much shape the entire outcome of a trial. A judge can decide to keep out certain witnesses. They can decide to keep out certain evidence. They can decide to keep out alibis, physical evidence, demonstrative evidence, testing, etc. So it's all going to be based on case law and how the judge is going to rule in regards to your motions. The reason why we're going to talk about the motions in limine in Scott Peterson's trial was because they really did shape the entire outcome of this trial, and he had a significant amount of appeals that he tried to conduct after this trial had finished, and a lot of them originally were based off of the motions in limine rulings. So the first ruling that the judge made was one that really upset the defense, and it came to be a big issue in appeals for many years later. So what happened was that the trial defense team, they conducted an experiment, and you'll hear why this experiment was so relevant as we get into the trial. But basically what happened was that they had purchased a boat that was the same size as Scott Peterson's boat. Now, it wasn't really a boat. I would call it more of like a dinghy. It was like this 14-foot, really small fishing boat. And they had purchased the boat that was the exact same size, the exact same model as Scott Peterson's. They took it out onto the bay, the same bay that Scott Peterson was fishing on, and the exact same conditions. So on the conditions on December 24th, it was said to have been really windy and really choppy. So they waited for a day that was very similar. in weathering patterns, so the water and the current could be similar as well. They then took a 100-pound dummy, a 100-pound human dummy, and they put it into this 14-foot dinger. And Laci Peterson at the time, she was 5 foot and she was 153 pounds because she was pregnant. And so this dummy was about 53 pounds lighter than Laci Peterson. But they put the 100-pound dummy into the boat with somebody that was the same like size and weight as Scott Peterson. And they went out into the bay, into the area that the district attorney was alleging that Scott had dumped the body. And every time, and they had it on film, every time that they had tried to throw over this 100-pound dummy, the boat would capsize. It would completely flip over, and basically like they would have to get like a whole team back out onto the water to help get the boat right size up into the water. And they tried it multiple times, and to them, through their experiment, it was just not possible to do what the district attorney was alleging. The judge ruled that this was not allowed into evidence. Next, the defense tried to bring in the sexual history of a woman by the name of Amber Fry, who was the district attorney's like star witness for this murder trial. And the reason why it was relevant was because Amber Fry was there to talk about Scott Peterson's sexual history. But the judge ruled that this was inadmissible. And continuing on with Amber Fry, the judge ruled that the district attorney was allowed to bring in Amber Fry's testimony of Scott Peterson's sexual history with her. The judge also ruled that the district attorney was allowed to bring in evidence of Scott's quote-unquote kind of unusual or incriminating behavior that came after the missing disappearance of Laci Peterson. Now we are going to get into opening statements. As we know, opening statements, they are not arguments. It is basically just telling the jury what the attorney believes the evidence is going to show throughout the trial. And the reason why it is so important is because the trial process is very painful. It's very specific and minute and honestly quite boring, that you're going to get a lot of this information kind of regurgitated at you, and you're not really going to know what it means. But if you have opening statement, it's kind of like a table of contents. Like, hey, look out for these pieces of information. So the district attorney goes first, as always, because they have the burden, so they have to put on a case. The district attorney in this trial, his name was Rick DiStasio. Now, the people had overcome a lot in their opening statements, and the reason why is because the Scott Peterson trial is like one of the only murder trials where it's purely circumstantial evidence, and there's not one shred of physical evidence, forensic evidence, or direct evidence, also known as demonstrative evidence. Now, in TV shows, all the time you will hear in these like cop shows or lawyer shows, we can't bring charges, we can't arrest them, this is all circumstantial, which is so weird because a majority of evidence is going to be circumstantial. And you are more than capable, obviously, hence Scott Peterson, to be charged and convicted on nothing more than circumstantial evidence. Now, let me explain what the difference is between circumstantial evidence and direct evidence. Okay, so direct evidence is going to be like exactly like what you see, right? So say you're outside sitting at a cafe and you see me walking down the street. It's cloudy outside. It was sprinkling like and raining about an hour ago, but it's not currently raining. And you see me walking down the street and you see this car drive by and the car hits a puddle and the puddle splashes all over me. And now my coat, my raincoat that I was wearing, has water all over it. Like it's wet, my hair's wet, there's water drops everywhere. Well, it's going to be direct evidence, right, that I'm wet because I was splashed by a car. Now let's change the situation up. Say you were inside of the cafe, not sitting outside of the cafe, and you knew that it was raining earlier, but you know, you haven't been outside in a while, and you see me come inside and you see that I have water all over me. And you to you, and you're like, okay, you look outside, maybe it's still sprinkling a little bit and the weather's still really gray, and then you'd be like, okay, she's wet because it's sprinkling. Like the raindrops got under her coat. That's circumstantial evidence. So it's not evidence that you saw, but you can get to it through logical deductive thinking. So in the opening statements, the district attorney says that the evidence is going to show that Scott Peterson actually murdered Laci Peterson on December 23rd. And then that evening, he had placed Laci's body in the back of his truck and left it there overnight, and he went to bed. And then the next morning on December 24th, he got into his car with Laci's dead body in the back of it, and he drove down to the marina where he had a secret boat that Laci didn't know about. And that the reason why it was so important that this boat was secret was because it was showing first degree murder, because again, for first degree murder, you have to show premeditation and deliberation. So they're basically saying like he had this secret boat and the secret warehouse that he never told Laci about because he was planning on killing her. And so he drove her dead body down to the secret boat in the secret marina and tossed the body into the bay. They said before he tossed the body into the bay that he had made 5 homemade anchors at his warehouse, and that the evidence was going to show that these anchors weighed about 8 pounds each, right? And that he had put on either 4 or 5 anchors onto Laci's body. So that is totaling between 32 pounds to 40 pounds. He tied 8 pounds around her left leg, 8 pounds around her right leg, 8 pounds around her left wrist, 8 pounds around her right wrist, and may or may not have tied an 8-pound anchor around her neck as well. And that this total of 40 pounds of the anchors had weighed her body down to the bottom of the bay. They then said that Scott was a liar, that Scott had premeditated this way beforehand. And the reason why that they knew that he was a liar was because he told the police that on December 24th, him and Laci were watching a TV show called Martha Stewart, which was a cooking channel back in the day. And that on the TV show on Martha Stewart, it was something about lemon meringues. And that the TV show actually had nothing to do with lemon meringues. And that they had looked at the TV show from December 24th, and Martha Stewart said nothing about lemon meringues and was not making them. The district attorney continues on saying that furthermore, the evidence is going to show that Scott was the murderer because of his behaviors that he exhibited after Laci's disappearance. That he was telling police that his wife had disappeared, they needed to get her back, and he knew that they would be able to find her and bring her back home safely. But if he really thought that Laci was going to be coming home, then why did he trade in her car? So he traded in Laci's Range Rover, and he got himself a new pickup truck. And this was before Laci was found dead, right? And so then he also was looking into selling their home in Modesto and moving. And so the district attorney was saying in his opening statements, that evidence is going to show you that Scott knew his wife was not coming home. He knew she wasn't missing. He knew there was no chance of her having a safe return home because he had killed her. Then they said the motive. Now, again, a district attorney doesn't have to prove motive, but when you're going for first degree murder, a jury's going to at least want to hear something about a motive or some sort of planning and premeditation, and how this isn't just a heat of passion argument that got out of hand. And the district attorney then brought in their key evidence and said that the evidence is going to show that there's a woman by the name of Amber Frey or Amber Fry, and that she was Scott's mistress. And that Scott wanted to be with this woman, and he didn't want to be with his wife, and he didn't want to have a child anymore either. And he wanted to completely start over. And he knew he couldn't just divorce Laci, because even if he divorced Laci, he would still be straddled with this kid that he would have to take care of. And he would always have to be around Laci and in the vicinity of Laci. And Amber lived in a completely different city, and he wouldn't be able to go live in that city with Amber because he would have this kid to take care of. So he wanted to get rid of his current life so he could start a new life. So now after the district attorney finished their opening statements, it's now the defense's turn to give their opening statements. And they can either go right after the district attorney, they could not do an opening statement at all, or they can reserve it to when they're about to put on their defense case. But they decided to go right after the district attorney, as most defense attorneys do, because you don't want the jury to sit with the DA's opening statements for too long. And right away, I think one of the most impactful things that the defense attorneys did was they grabbed the tape recording from the Martha Stewart cooking show from December 24th, and they literally plugged it into a TV and pressed play and had the entire jury watch the December 24th Martha Stewart show. And she was, in fact, making lemon meringues.
Egg white story. Ooh, you want to make little meringues? Oh, that would be nice.
The defense goes on to say that the evidence is actually going to show that Scott was innocent, and that not only did the police jump the gun, but that the police lied, and that the district attorney is lying, and that they have constantly tried to conceal the evidence and edit their reports and leave evidence out, right? They go on to say that the police actually collected over 100 really large bags of evidence from Scott's home and from his warehouse, and they showed up zero forensic evidence of murder. That not only did the district attorney pour in thousands of dollars, hundreds of thousands of dollars into forensic testing into the Scott Peterson case, that all showed up negative. Like, it showed no signs of murder. It showed no signs of foul play. So not only was all this forensic evidence pointing to the fact that Scott was innocent, but that there was too many contradictions in the people's purely circumstantial theory. And that's the issue with circumstantial theory, is that when you have a lot of coincidences, then it starts planting reasonable doubt. And that's what's really hard about a purely circumstantial situation. As you heard me explain earlier, it's very possible, seeing someone with a raincoat on, that it may still be raining, or maybe it stopped and I got splashed, or maybe the rain was from 3 hours ago. So that's the hard part with circumstantial evidence. So now the defense in their opening statement is going to show that the people's storyline doesn't match up. And the reason why it's not going to match up is because they said that they were going to call in 13 eyewitnesses from December 24th that saw Lacey walking their dog, Mackenzie, around the park in their neighborhood, and that this was Lacey's usual walk. And that if you put every sighting on a map, it goes through a loop from her daily walk that many people will testify to, that Lacey always did this walk. And so she could not have died on the 23rd by the people's theory, because she was out walking this dog. And they said that the evidence was going to show that while she's being seen by these 13 eyewitnesses, they'll also see evidence that Scott was sending emails from his warehouse down at the marina, which was not close to their Modesto home. They said that the evidence is going to show you that the district attorney can't tell you how Lacey died. They can't tell you when Lacey died, where Lacey died, the exact timing, who did it, that they can't tell you anything. And that the entire investigation was completely botched from start to finish. So the first witness that the prosecution called was a woman by the name of Sharon Rocha, and she was Lacey Peterson's mother. So Sharon testified that on December 24th, around 5:15 p.m., Scott had called her and asked her if Lacey was over at their home. And when Sharon told him no, that she hadn't been there all day after she got home from the movies, because she had gone to the movies earlier that day with a girlfriend, that Scott told her, like, oh shit, Lacey's missing. And so she said that Ron, her husband, or her partner at the time, had called the police right after that. She said that that evening they all got together and they went over to Scott and Lacey's home to not only look in the park for Lacey, but to wait together for the police. And she said that she was trying to console Scott that evening, but he kept like moving away from her. Like, he didn't want to be near her. And she said that it was like really hard to get his attention like that entire evening. She also testified that on December 14th, they were throwing a friends and family Christmas party, and that Scott was absent from it. And when she had asked Lacey, like, where is Scott? Lacey told her mom that Scott had to fly out last minute to San Francisco because his boss was requiring him to be there for work. Sharon continues on testifying about Scott's demeanor after the disappearance of Lacey. She said that he was literally going out of his way to avoid talking to her. And she specifically recalls on January 14th, they had this family dinner, and she had asked Scott like a very specific question. She asked him like, hey, like, what do you use to go fishing? And Scott just like wouldn't answer her. He just like stayed mute and wouldn't acknowledge her at all. And so instead, a different family member had to answer the question for Scott. She also said that on April 15th, when they were notified about Lacey's body washing up ashore, she had called Scott and she had left him a message and told Scott, like, you need to get home, like, right away. Like, we all need to, like, be together as a family. And Scott completely ignored her message and never called her back. On cross-examination, Sharon testified that she actually never saw Scott and Lacey ever have marital problems, and she never saw them fighting. And she thought that Scott was just the most perfect son-in-law and that he could have never committed this murder all the way up until she found out about Amber Fry. And that's when she had changed her mind and thought, okay, he has this mistress, he's a liar, he killed my daughter. She also testified that walking Mackenzie in the park near her home was part of Lacey's daily routine. The next witness that was called to the stand was Ron Gransky. He was Lacey's like stepdad. I can't figure out if him and Sharon were married because it goes back and forth between calling him a stepdad and then calling him Sharon's like domestic partner. But he was called to the stand next. And he testified that he was actually fishing at the exact same time on December 24th as Scott was. And he testified that he remembers Scott like being unusually late to fishing and that it probably quote unquote like rubbed Scott the wrong way when he asked him like, why is he so late to start his like fishing day? He also testified that he doesn't believe that Lacey was walking the dog that morning because on the path that she would take in this park, there was this like pretty intense incline, and that he doesn't think Lacey would have been able to make it up there at 8.5 months pregnant, and that recently Lacey has had a lot of trouble walking in general and getting tired very quickly from walking, and that even though he's in his 60s, he's still in really good shape, and walking up that incline is hard for him. Ron then testified that he was convinced of Scott's guilt of murder on January 15th when the police showed him pictures of Scott and Amber Fry, his mistress, together. He said that combined with the fact that after Lacey had disappeared, Scott was not only avoiding his wife, he was also avoiding him as well. On cross-examination, Ron testified that the police did reach out to him and ask him if he could start recording his phone calls with Scott. And they brought like these recording devices from a place called Radio Shack. And that he did in fact record those calls. And the defense brought in one call in particular between him and Scott. Ron had, he was shouting at Scott on the phone, basically saying, if you had something to do with this, you better just say so. You better come forward about like killing Lacey. Like, just tell me if you had something to do with this. And Scott said, and I quote, "My world is done without Lacey and my child. We all want her back. I'm sorry you guys think I had something to do with it. The only important thing is getting her back." Also on cross-examination, Ron testified that in general, even before Lacey's disappearance, Scott was a very stoic person. He wasn't very emotional. He never lost his temper. He never got angry. You never really like saw him like fly off the handle, like in an angry way, a sad way, a happy way. He was just very stoic. But he said that on the night of the disappearance, that Scott was just an emotional wreck. And he said that not only did this happen on the night of the disappearance, but this happened several more times during the disappearance of Lacey, that Scott was extremely emotional. He was then asked about Berkeley Bay, which is where the people were alleging that Scott had dumped Lacey Peterson's body. And Ron testified that there was a lot of areas in Berkeley Bay that were very secluded and very private, and that Ron wasn't going to say exactly where he fishes in Berkeley Bay because I guess as a fisherman, you want to keep that private so like people don't come to your fishing spots. And so then he was asked about where it was being alleged that Scott had dumped Lacey's body in the Berkeley Bay. And Ron testified that no, that was not a secluded or private spot at all, that there was actually no privacy to it. And it was a very, very open area to the public. And so then he was asked, you know, so anybody could see. And Ron said, yeah, anyone could see. It's open. Like, there's nowhere to hide in that area. The defense attorney then asked, like, okay, so why do you think he would dump the body in a public area instead of a private area? And you said that Scott fishes all the time, and Scott knows of these secret areas, these secluded areas, so why would he dump a body out in the open? And Ron didn't answer that question. I bet you anything it was objected to as speculation. The next person that was called to the stand was a woman by the name of Kara Service, and she was the Petersons' neighbor. She testified that on December 24th, she saw Mackenzie, the Peterson dog, like standing outside of the Petersons' home with its collar on and its leash on, just walking itself with no owner. She said that the leash was very dirty, like it was very muddy. There was a bunch of like sand and grass and dirt clumps all over it, and that it looked like it had been like dragged through hell. She said that the lawn to the Petersons' home, like the front lawn, was wet with dew, but that Kenzie's coat, like its fur coat, was completely dry. And she said all of the grass area was like wet with dew, but Mackenzie was like very dry. She said that the back gate to the Peterson home was open at a 90-degree angle, but that nobody was back there. So she decided to put Mackenzie into the back gate, into the backyard of the Peterson home, lock it, and leave, because she didn't think much of it. She said that this couldn't have been any later than 10:18 a.m. She said that she left right after she put Mackenzie into the backyard, and she didn't return until 11:45. And when she returned home, she had noticed that there was a package sticking outside of the mailbox of the Peterson home. And that this was significant because on cross-examination, she testified that the mail is usually delivered between 10:30 and 11 a.m. and that the mailman usually has a policy where he won't deliver mail if there's an animal like outside that isn't like leashed or chained or in the backyard or in the home. She also testified that Scott had called her like numerous times after Lacey had disappeared, wanting to make sure that she knew and she was positive on the timing that she saw Mackenzie. She also testified that the last time she saw Lacey was on December 22nd with Scott, that they were in the front yard and Scott was mowing the lawn and Lacey was like gardening and basically just kind of like giving Scott direction, and that they seemed really happy. Just like this happy couple right before Christmas, gardening and mowing their lawn together. She said that she didn't hear anything unusual on the night of the 23rd or the morning of the 24th, that she lived right next to the Peterson home and she didn't hear any sounds of a struggle or screaming. Now, this next testimony is really important. It's by the name of Susan Medina, and she lived right across the street from the Petersons, like right in front of them. She testified that on the morning of the 24th, she was up at 5 in the morning and Scott and Lacey's car were both in the driveway, that she had left and went home, like went for family for Christmas, and that when she came home on the 26th, the morning of the 26th, she had realized that her house had been burglarized and it was completely ransacked. She said there was like a cart that was outside of the front of their home that was obvious, like what the burglars were using to get objects and materialistic things from inside their home out into whatever vehicle they were using to commit the robbery. She said that the home was completely ransacked. The kids' rooms were almost completely empty. She said on top of like their home being ransacked, they also had this shed that was outside, and that the shed had also been broken into, and a bunch of tools were stolen from the shed, including a bunch of gloves and a hammer. She then testified that Scott had come over to her house with defense investigators, and that this was after Lacey's disappearance, but before Scott had ever been arrested, and that he came over with these like this defense team and these defense investigators, and he was trying to find Lacey. So they were just asking them like a bunch of questions, trying to put together like this timeline in order to see if they could find Lacey and Connor. She also testified that they had a really bad like transient issue going on in their area, in their neighborhood, and that there was this encampment like camp that was not even a quarter mile away from them. And so the park that was kind of connected to their home that was like in their living area, like their neighborhood. She said that a lot of the people that were homeless would come there during the day and even come back and like sleep there during the night, and that they had been causing like a lot of issues. They have been trying to break into homes. They were trying to break into like the trash cans, which you can't really break into the trash cans, but they were taking things from the trash cans. And she said that this park that they were at is actually the park that was part of Lacey's everyday walking routine, and that she had seen Lacey do this walk multiple times, and that, you know, she always thought it was quite unsafe of Lacey to be doing that as a woman by herself because of the transient issue that they were having, and that a lot of these people that were in the park were also on drugs. She also said that the media coverage on this was absolutely insane, and that at one point in time, Scott had to leave Modesto and he couldn't, and will be important. She said, because the district attorney, the reason why this is important is because the district attorney was alleging in their opening statements that Scott had ran and fled, and that they were alleging that he was trying to flee to Mexico in order to escape murder charges. But the defense was arguing, no, that's not true. He was living in San Diego with his family, and that he even informed the police that he was going to move down to San Diego to be with his family because of the media. So she's now being asked on cross-examination about the media, and she said that the media was absolutely insane. She said Scott was unable to get in and out of his home, and that media members were actually stealing things off of his property, like stealing bricks from his home and like pulling things apart, and that they were there night and day. So now we are going to group all of the police testimony together because there were a lot of officers called, and here were just some of them. Byron Darefeld, Craig Wend, John Hudson, David Corder, Derek Lestinger, John Evers. And then we'll get to the second group of police officers once we're done with these officers. And the reason why I'm grouping them together is so the story can come out easier instead of really kind of broken up and shaky if it was just each individual person. So Officer Darefeld arrived to the Peterson home on December 24th of 2002. By the time he got there, Officer Evans, Lestingson, and Spurlock had just concluded their initial walkthrough with Scott Peterson. The officers all got together and started talking to each other outside the presence of Scott Peterson. And the initial walkthrough officers said they found Scott to be really suspicious because there was no new food in the fridge. And that would mean that Scott wasn't being truthful when he said that Lacey had gone grocery shopping recently. They said that it was also suspicious that Scott had duffel bags in his bedroom, that there were drinking glasses just sitting on the counter. And they said they also found it suspicious that he had like a mop and a bucket inside of their cabinet. So after a brief 5-minute conversation together, they had decided that they needed to call in the homicide detective team. Now, the officers did testify that this was quite unusual to call in homicide detectives after only assessing the scene for 5 minutes, but they decided to do it in this case. So it was at this point when they had basically started ruling that this was a homicide, that the officers had ordered for all the other officers to do a sweep of the park again that Lacey had commonly walked down, and that they were going to look at a vacant home that was nearby to see if Lacey was maybe there or being held there. A helicopter search was also conducted this evening. The helicopter search was conducted between the hours of 8:30 p.m. to 11 p.m. The helicopter was also using this technology called FLIR, and it's able to basically like give off human readings. And they said that there was absolutely no human readings for the entire like almost 2 hours of this investigation with the helicopter over the park. They also did ground searches, including checking out the encampment, the homeless encampment that was about a quarter mile away from the Peterson home. And they went into all of the tents of the people that are unhoused down there, and it came up with no findings of Lacey and no evidence of Lacey either. They said that during the initial walkthrough with Scott, that Scott was showing a lot of concern and a lot of emotion, and so much so that he like threw his flashlight on the ground and started cussing. And they said because of like how emotional and like distraught he was, it was one of the reasons why they had decided to kind of rule this a homicide so quickly. So that evening, Scott did agree to go back to the police station with the officers to give statements and to kind of tell them about the day. And Scott said that they had woken up as usual early in the morning. They had breakfast together as they always do. And then from the hours of 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., they had watched the Martha Stewart channel. And when asked, like, what was Martha Stewart talking about on the show, he said something about like lemon meringues. He said after the show had ended, he had gone down to the marina for some work and to go fishing, and that Lacey had gone on her usual walk with their dog Mackenzie around the park. Scott said that he had actually stayed out fishing in Berkeley Bay longer than he had intended and longer than he had promised Lacey, and he was supposed to be picking up something from the store that evening for their Christmas Eve dinner at Lacey's parents' house. So he had called her on his way back from the bay and left her a message asking her if she could please like go pick up the stuff from the store. He said when he got home that his dog Mackenzie was outside in the backyard, but he didn't think anything of it because that was pretty common and pretty usual, as most people like do have their dogs in the backyard. And when he didn't see Lacey in the house, he also didn't think it was unusual because he had just assumed that she had gone over to her parents' house early. But by the time it had started getting later and he hadn't heard from her, that's when he got concerned and he had called Lacey's parents to see if that's where Lacey was. And when he found out that she wasn't there and hadn't been there all day, that is when Scott had decided to report her missing. The police asked for proof of his alibi that he was at the marina, so he did hand them over a parking ticket, like a receipt of a parking ticket for the parking lot at the Marina Bay in Berkeley Bay. Well, the police then testified that they started becoming suspicious of Scott that evening, and specifically during this interrogation, because they said that Scott was really, really calm. And they, in fact, said that he was, quote unquote, like too calm, especially for his wife being missing, especially when he was, you know, so emotional previously. They also said what grew their suspicion even more was that they had then gone back and watched the episode of the Martha Stewart channel that was on December 24th, and there was no mention of lemon meringue. It is brought up later through the cross-examination of an officer by the name of Alan Brocchini, which we will get into more in depth, that lemon meringues were actually talked about, and that was what the Martha Stewart segment was about. But they testified that, you know, when they first initially watched it on the 24th, there was no mention of a lemon meringue. The other heavy hitter for the police during this conversation, and I think a really big heavy hitter for the jury as well, was that he was referring to Lacey in the past tense during these interviews, which was really strange because he had just found out that Lacey was missing. So that's what they're testifying to. They're saying that they find it really strange because he had just found out that Lacey was missing. He said he found out around, 5:15, 5:30 when he had called Lacey's parents' house and found out that she was not there. And then they had just searched for her like up until like the early morning of the next day, and that Scott was already referring to Lacey in the past tense, and that you typically don't do that if you don't think your partner's dead. So what happens after this is the police testified that because they were suspicious of Scott now, they had decided to try to search his home. They couldn't get a judge to sign a warrant because the only way the judge is going to sign a warrant is if you can prove that you have probable cause and a reasonable belief that there is evidence of a crime like in this area that you are going to search, and that this evidence can be destroyed if you like don't get this evidence right now, if you don't go search for it. Now, search warrants have to be very, very specific. It has to say what you're searching for and like where you're searching for it to. You usually don't get to search an entire home. At least in the state of California, you have to specifically say, I'm looking for in this area or in these places that it could be concealed in and like what it is, right? But a judge didn't sign off on a warrant here because there was no reasonable belief that Scott had committed a crime and there was no probable cause. So the only other way that you're going to be able to search a home is if the person gives you consent. So the police showed up and they had a warrant in hand and they were like, hey, this isn't judge ordered, but we would like you to sign off on this warrant and give us permission to search your home. They continued testifying that Scott said no, that Scott had told them, I would rather have a lawyer look over this first before I sign it and before I give you permission to like come and search inside of my home. And so the officers then testified that this was kind of like what made Scott their main suspect. That this is what made them believe like, hey, Scott did this. They testified that because if you're innocent, you would have nothing to hide. I just want to quickly state really quickly for anyone that's listening, if the police come to search your home, please say no. Especially if you're innocent. Just a big disclaimer, a police's job is to not find the truth. A police's job is to just find things they can prove against you, and there's a big difference. But eventually the police were able to get a search warrant for the 2 Peterson computers. So Scott had a computer at his warehouse down at the marina, and then there was also a computer at the Peterson home that both of them used. Now the computer at the Peterson home that was used by both Scott and Lacey, there was a search that was conducted on it at 8:45 in the morning. And the only reason why I'm talking about this evidence wasn't brought into trial, but it was brought up in appeals. And it was brought up in a lot of appeals for significant Brady violations that were occurring throughout this trial, as you will continue hearing about them. So there were searches at 8:45 in the morning. And the searches were for sunflower umbrellas. And there's a lot of evidence that Lacey was obsessed with sunflowers. She had it tattooed on her. She had dresses, bikinis, like lawn pool stuff that was all sunflower themed. So it was really strong evidence that was going towards, it was Lacey that was making those searches on December 24th at 8:45 in the morning, meaning that the prosecution's theory that she was murdered on the 23rd is flawed because this is evidence that she could have been alive. Now, what is a Brady violation? A Brady violation is when the district attorney doesn't turn over any and all exculpatory evidence that they find. Exculpatory evidence is evidence that is going to help the defense. Any evidence that the prosecution finds that could go towards the defense's innocence or go towards helping their case, they have to turn over. And they didn't turn this information over. Instead, they try to bury it. And then what they testified to, what was revealed on Scott's computer at the warehouse was a bunch of work emails. Like around like 10:30 in the morning, there was a bunch of work emails that were sent out, like Merry Christmas emails and emails to clients, things like that. So the police continue their testimony on direct examination. And they tell the district attorney and they testify in front of the jury that they did a thorough investigation of the bay, and that although they didn't find any of Lacey's remains or any evidence pointing to Lacey's like physical remains, that they did bring a canine dog out to the scene of the bay, and that this canine had picked up the scent of Lacey's body. They also testified that they did a really intense deep dive into Scott's warehouse on the marina, and they did a bunch of forensic testing on objects at his warehouse, including like his warehouse almost in its entirety, and that there was absolutely no like forensic evidence that came about any of these testings, but that they did find what they believed was the area where he made anchors. So there was this one anchor, and it was this homemade anchor, and it weighed about 8 pounds. And they said that they believed that he had made between 4 to 5 other anchors. And the reason why they believed this, and they showed this picture, and I'll have it on the screen here. Now, I can't see what they're seeing, but basically they said that there was a bunch of concrete, like residue powder, because you have to mix concrete powder with water to make concrete. And they said that there was all this residue of this powder just kind of like laying around, and that they believed that it had marked out like 4 to 5 like other circles or rectangles. I think they said circles, that was in the shape of like these homemade concrete anchors. And they believed that not only did he make 5 more anchors, but the reason why they weren't in the warehouse was because he had attached them to Lacey's limbs to weigh her down into the bottom of the bay. They then continued their testimony on direct examination and said that on April 13th of 2003, Lacey's body had washed ashore. This was about 4 months after Lacey had been reported missing. Lacey's body had washed up on the eastern shore of the San Francisco Bay near Richmond, and Connor, the baby, the unborn baby, his body was no longer inside of her, and his body had been washed up, I believe it was about a mile away from where she was. And Lacey's body, the only part of her body that was there was her torso. There was no legs, arms, or a head. The police continued testifying, saying that the judge wouldn't issue an arrest warrant for Scott Peterson until they were able to get a DNA match and prove that it was Lacey Peterson and Connor Peterson. So the police had gone down to San Diego to go get a DNA sample from Scott. So they did testify that Scott did tell them and notify them that he was going to be going down to San Diego to spend time with his family. And so they had to go all the way down to San Diego to get this DNA sample. But once the results came back, it was a match. And this was, in fact, Lacey and Connor Peterson. And therefore, the arrest warrant was issued. Now we will get into the cross-examination of all of these police officers. So they were asked on cross-examination, why did the police give a press conference about Scott Peterson's alibi? And they got the police to admit that this was completely a huge violation of police protocol and that you're actually not allowed to give out an alibi on television, because just in case Scott wasn't the murderer, if the actual murderer was out there and he sees that the police had already inspected this area and ruled it out, the actual murderer can then go there and dump the body, basically. And so the police tried to testify on cross-examination that the reason why they had given out this alibi was because they were trying to confirm it. They were trying to have someone come forward and confirm that he was at the marina. And then they were confronted with, well, okay, you talked to Ron, who was fishing on the same day and saw Scott, and you also have the receipt to the marina, so you had already confirmed his alibi. They didn't really have a response after that to it. And not that this was like a big hit for the defense, but it was just the defense's beginning of showing how much the police have lied throughout the trial and throughout the investigation. But what did happen from this press interview was actually Amber Fry. And we will get into that in a little bit. So the next thing that happened on cross-examination was the police were now being confronted with a bunch of phone calls that they had received through eyewitnesses. So the defense was coming forward with 11 reports from 11 different eyewitnesses saying that they had seen Lacey and given the exact description of Lacey Peterson and what she was wearing that day and of Mackenzie, and saying that they had seen her on this walk on December 24th. And they had seen her on the walk after 10 a.m. And in fact, like the timeline was putting her between like 10 a.m. to 11:30. And they were also trying to show the police officers that, hey, if you put it all on a map where all these callers were located, you know, it would make a loop around the park, which you were told was Lacey's usual walking route. And the police said, yes, we did receive those 11 phone calls identifying Lacey's description and Mackenzie's description. And the defense then asked if they ever followed up on those eyewitnesses, and the police said no. And they were asked, okay, well, did you not follow up because then it hurts your theory? Because if she was found alive after 10 a.m., Scott couldn't have done it because at like 10:30 or so, he was at the marina sending off emails, and the receipt for the marina was even before then. And the police just said, no, we just didn't find it important. We didn't find these eyewitnesses to be important to look up for Laci's disappearance. Also, in cross-examination, the police officers testified that they received a phone call from a man by the name of Cam Harshman. And he was like a reserved police officer. So like he was retired, but he was also like reserved. So he could be called upon to like go give service. And he had called the police and he had told them that on December 24th, he saw this woman matching the description of Laci Peterson really close by to the Peterson home as well. That he had seen a woman matching Laci Peterson's description from her outfit to how pregnant she was, to her hair, to everything, and that she was outside of a white van with these two men that were like holding her. And he thought it was weird. And the reason why he called the police was because this woman was urinating on the side of the road. This pregnant woman was, with these two men that were like holding her. And then when she was done urinating, they threw her in the back of this white van. And the reason why the white van part is important to the defense and why they're bringing up right now about this phone call was because it also came out during cross-examination about the burglary that happened across the home at Susan Medina's house. The police officers were questioned more about this burglary that happened at Susan's house, and she was right across the street from the Petersons. And there was 3 eyewitnesses, and the 3 eyewitnesses to the burglary had told the police officers that it was with 3 men, and that one was a driver, 2 were in the back of this white van, and the white van had matched the description of what Tom had called in about a woman being held outside of a white van. So the police then asked, okay, well, with this burglary and this phone call by this reserved police officer, did you look into it? And the police officers testified that no, they didn't follow up on this lead because they didn't think it was important. And the reason why they didn't think it was important was because they said that the burglary happened on the 26th and Laci had gone missing on the 24th. And after they said that, the defense attorney then confronted him with 2 more police reports that they had tried to redact and they had tried to bury as well. And the police officers admitted that they had redacted it, and I'll get into that in a moment. What happened was there was these 2 women called forward. So when they had given a press conference asking for Scott's alibi, they had also talked about the burglary, and they had also said that they had ruled out the burglary as any part of Laci's disappearance because it happened on the 26th. So after that news was shown out, a woman had called and said, hey, you have it wrong. I told you that the burglary happened on the 24th. I saw it. Like, I actually saw the burglary happening. It wasn't on the 26th. It was on the 24th. A different woman had called in as well, asking them, like, why were they lying? That she had given them a statement and she had seen the white van and the burglars on the 24th and not the 26th. So they were confronted with both of these police reports, and both of the police reports were redacted. And this evidence was attempted to be hid from the defense attorneys. The defense then brought in how there was a tip that was called in about somebody saying that they saw Laci Peterson being held in this area in Tracy. And this location, specifically in Tracy, was known for parolees, like very violent felon parolees. And that this specific area and these specific parolees were known for like hating cops and being very, very dangerous towards the police officers as well. So the police testified that because of this, for officer safety, they decided to not actually inspect the area. What they did was they got a helicopter and they used the heat technology while flying over this parolee area, and that the heat technology did show signs and did give readings and radars of what could have been a human or humans, or it could have been like large animals. And when the defense attorney asked if they had ever followed up on it, like, okay, you may have had a human reading, you were told that Laci Peterson was seen being held here. Did you look into it? And they said no. They said due to officer safety, they just went home and they didn't look into the area again. Cross-examination also gave a lot of insight into the cadaver dog that was used that found the scent of Lacey's deceased body there. So on cross-examination, the police admitted that they originally brought out a trained police canine that was a cadaver dog, and that the police dog didn't find any scent of a cadaver, of a dead body. And so what happened was that the dog that did find Lacey's scent of her dead body was actually this dog that belonged to this woman who was not a police officer. And this dog was not a trained cadaver dog. And in fact, on cross-examination, the police did admit that the dog actually had no certifications or training, and that the dog had tried numerous times to get training and get specialized and certified in being a cadaver dog by this woman, and that the dog had failed significantly each time. And so they were relying off of that dog's scent that Lacey's body was there. They also did admit that the dog was heavily drawn towards dead animals, the scent of dead animals that were along the bay and along this area as well. And although the defense did a really great job at discrediting the scent of this unqualified, uncertified cadaver dog, unfortunately for the defense and for Scott Peterson, it made such a big impact on the jury the first time that they heard it, that this one juror gave an interview years later saying that she believes that Scott Peterson is guilty because that woman's dog picked up on Lacey's scent. So now we're going to take a brief pause here, because at this point in time, a juror is now being dismissed. So you have 12 jury members that are going to be deciding your fate. But juries could always get dismissed. Something could always happen. So you always have alternates as well. And for things just like what I'm about to talk about, there was a juror number 5, by the name of Justin. And when you're a jury member, you are going to be told that you are not allowed to discuss the case like at all. You can't discuss the case with friends, family. You can't discuss the case even amongst other jurors until you're told it's time to deliberate. And it was alleged that Justin was talking to the other jury members, and he was telling them, hey, the prosecution keeps lying. You know, I think Scott is innocent. Don't you think it's weird that the prosecution keeps lying? Don't you think it's weird that the police had tried to hide all of these reports, and they try to delete all these reports, and that they're lying on the stand too? Well, this was reported, and because of that, because he was discussing the case before he was allowed to, he was dismissed, and an alternate came to sit in his spot. Now we're going to go back to the police testimony, and specifically we are going to focus on an officer called Alan Brochini. And the defense attorney just went so hard at this police officer. I mean, to the point where the judge had to take a recess and tell the officer and the defense attorney to go cool down and go take a moment and don't come back into this courthouse until you guys are going to both be professionals. Now, on cross-examination, the defense was able to get this police officer to admit that when they went down to the Berkeley Bay, they were actually able to find 2 witnesses, these 2 fishermen that saw Scott that day, and was able to put timestamps on when they saw Scott as well. And there was one in specific that allegedly told the police that not only did he see Scott that day, but he saw Scott getting loaded into his boat, into his 14-foot fisherman boat, and drive off into the bay. And that he told the police that when he looked into the boat and he was able to directly see into it, he didn't see a dead body. The police admitted that, and then he was asked, okay, well, why did you redact this from your report? You deleted it from your original report amongst many other things, and we had to find your original report in order to find out this information. And Alan Brochini, the detective, admitted on cross-examination, and I quote, that he surgically cut out, end quote, from his police report, including a conversation that he had with a woman by the name of Peggy O'Donnell. And he said that he had decided to surgically cut things out of his report that he didn't think was relevant to the investigation. And the reason why he didn't think that the witness's testimony was relevant about seeing directly into Scott's boat was because Scott would have been able to hide Lacey's body under a tarp. And that was actually something that was administered throughout the trial too. They took a human that was the size of Lacey Peterson. She was just about, I think, two inches shorter than Lacey or 2 inches taller than Lacey. She was the same weight, around 150 pounds. And they got the same size boat and they had this woman lie in it and they put a tarp over her to show the jury that you could be hid in this boat. So like that guy looking in and seeing nothing didn't really mean anything because you could hide Lacey's body under a tarp. But so that's why he said he surgically redacted it, because he didn't think it was that important. So then he was also confronted with his original report with a statement that he took from Peggy O'Donnell. So in the police report that was turned over to the defense, it stated that Lacey did not know about the warehouse and she didn't know about Scott's boat either. But once he was confronted with his original police report, he admitted that yes, there was a woman who owned like this shop that was right across from Scott's warehouse, and Lacey had actually gone in there on like the 23rd, I think it was, to use the restroom. And so this was a huge hit to the prosecution, because not only is it showing like how much the police was lying and redacting things that they shouldn't have redacted, because the prosecution could have refuted each and every point, but that Lacey did know about this boat and she did know about the warehouse. And that was a big thing for the prosecution, because that was one of their big their big hits on, hey, this is why it's premeditated and this is why it's deliberated. He hid this warehouse and he hid this boat from her so he could use it to get rid of her body. But now the defense is proving, hey, she actually knew about this boat. She's been at the warehouse. And I know I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but Brochini also admitted on cross-examination that he lied in multiple affidavits in order to get like a search warrant for Scott Peterson. He said that he was quote unquote inaccurate on about 3 or 4 different affidavits, and those were the affidavits that the judge relied on in order to issue an arrest, in order to issue a warrant to not only search the warehouse and the home, but to also get wiretapping on Scott Peterson as well. She also testified that there was a woman by the name of Kim McGregor, and that after Lacey had disappeared, Scott had kind of enlisted this woman as a way to have help with Mackenzie, with walking Mackenzie. And that after Lacey had gone missing, Kim had actually broken into the home and she stole Lacey Peterson's social security card, and she also like stole Scott Peterson's underwear. And when they asked if they had followed up like on her being a lead at all for this murder, they said no. She was then asked if he had investigated any other suspects besides Scott Peterson, and he responded with, and I quote, "None were going in the direction we wanted them to go. We started planting seeds of suspicion for Scott Peterson." Now we're going to get into more officer testimony. These are from detectives. Ricky Armendariz, Adam McGill, Ray Coyle, Rudy Scutley, Doug Lovell, Kim Castro, and Henry Dodge. And we're going to group them together too, because all of their testimony doesn't make sense unless it's together. So they were all involved in the search of the San Francisco Bay and the Berkeley Bay for Lacey Peterson's body. In fact, they did many, many searches, but the searches that we are going to focus on is going to be May 10th, May 16th, May 17th, May 18th, September 11th, and September 18th as well. These searches, these officers or these detectives, these specialty people, they had testified that this involved the Modesto Police Department utilized specialized drivers, side scans, sonars, and REMUS devices. They said that they started in a high probability area with the special dive team and sonar equipment specifically in this area that they believed was the high probability of Lacey's body. They testified that they used all of the special dive team and all the equipment and all the resources possible to try to find Lacey's body, Connor's body, any limbs, clothing articles, or anchors in the bay, and they couldn't find anything. They testified that the visibility in the bay, and if you're in Northern California, you can attest to this, is pretty poor. It's pretty piss poor. That you wouldn't really even be able to see something like arm's length away from you. So these officers also testified about the anchors as well, and they said that although they did not find any anchors in the bay that they searched, and that they did in fact search them very thoroughly, and they didn't find them washed up on the shore, and they didn't find them in Scott's home or in the warehouse, the reason why they believed that they were made was because of the residue that the Modesto Police Department had found as well. And they believed that they also could see like a pattern of circles within the concrete powder that was sprayed over like the floored area where Scott was making these homemade anchors. Now we're going to get into the district attorney's like star witness. Her name is Amber Frey or Amber Fry. I don't know how to pronounce it. Now, she testified that she had met Scott through a mutual friend by the name of Sean Shelby. And she said that they began dating around November 20th of 2002. So about a month and 4 days before Lacey Peterson had gone missing. She testified that when she had met Scott told her that he was single. But she said on December 9th of 2002, her friend Shelby had come up to her, and she was a mutual friend between her and Scott, right? Because she had known them both, that she had gone up to Amber and was like, what the fuck? I just found out that like Scott's married, like he has a wife. So Amber testifies that their mutual friend then confronts Scott and was like, you better tell Amber like everything, you better call her, like what the fuck is wrong with you? You have a whole ass wife. So Amber testifies that Scott calls her that evening on December 9th, and he tells her that he did lie to her, but that he isn't currently married, that he was married, but that he had lost his wife about a year ago, and that this was going to be the first holiday season that he has without his wife. She testified that she didn't ask any more questions because Scott was crying pretty hard and was really emotional when he was telling her this. And so she had just assumed that his wife had died to cancer. And Amber continues her testimony and says that she believed this, and that she believed that Scott had lost his wife. And she believed this all the way up until she saw the news. And she saw the news episode where the police officers did that press conference where they released Scott's alibi to the public when they weren't supposed to. It's against protocol. But they had released it, and Amber saw that. And when she saw it, she called into the police department and came forward as Scott's mistress, saying, I've been dating this man for like over a month now, and he told me his wife was dead. So Amber then testifies that the police asked her, like, hey, can you please continue on this relationship? Like, don't cut him off. We would like it if not only you would continue the relationship, but that if you would also record the calls. And she had agreed to do this. Amber also testified that Scott was her date to a friends and like work holiday Christmas party. And there's a very infamous picture of this specific holiday party. And she's sitting on his lap. He's wearing a Santa hat, and she's like all nuzzled into his face and like into his neck. And she testified that later on she found out that Scott had actually lied to his wife, saying that he was in San Francisco for work when he was supposed to be at the family holiday party with 8-month pregnant Lacey Peterson and his in-laws. But he lied, saying he was going to San Francisco for work when really he was with Amber at this holiday party. So now let's get into the phone calls. There was many phone calls that were played that were more sexual in nature. You know, he's telling Amber how sexy she is, and she's like describing like what she's wearing to him. But there was one specific call that kind of put like the nail in the coffin for Scott. And this call was from December 31st of 2002. Now on this date, Scott and Lacey's parents were having this like candlelight memorial for Lacey, like this candlelight ceremony, and like hundreds and hundreds of people that were concerned about Lacey and had seen this on the news, they all showed up, and like there was a microphone and everything. But it was this huge candlelight ceremony, and while they're there to honor Lacey and be begging and pleading in the news cameras to just bring their daughter home and to not harm their daughter and to not kill her and to let my wife come home. Through all of this, Scott calls Amber. He tells Amber that he is in Paris celebrating the new year, and that everyone is at the Eiffel Tower right now, and it's just so incredible and so lively, and everyone is just celebrating New Year's, and he's having the best time ever in Paris, and that he misses her. The defense tried to combat all of this by bringing up and having Amber testify that although they seemed kind of serious because he went to that Christmas party with her, they had only actually been on 4 dates. So how serious could it have been if they were only together for 4 different dates? They also were trying to combat the Paris Eiffel Tower call during Lacey's like candlelight ceremony by playing many other recorded calls between the two of them. One of them was Scott finally coming forward and telling Amber that he had lied, that he had a wife, her name was Lacey, and that she was currently missing. And Amber asked him, "Did you have anything to do with it?" And he said, "Of course not." And she said, "Okay, well, if you didn't have anything to do with it, why did you tell me on December 9th that you had lost your wife?" And he responded to her, and I quote, "There's different types of losing, Amber." Another call was introduced, and Amber called him, and she said to him, and I quote, "What are you going to do if I go to the police?" And he said, and I quote, "Nothing. You can go to the police if you want to, because I have nothing to hide and I won't be mad at you." Amber then asked, how will you handle the blowout of this whole situation if I go to the police? And he said, and I quote, "There's nothing to handle because I didn't do anything. And I'm going to continue doing what I've been doing, which is looking for Lacey. I'm trying to find my wife." And Amber kept pushing for details on Lacey, and he kept pushing for him to basically say he didn't love Lacey, and that's why he was having an affair. But he kept being very adamant during these calls that he was in love with his wife. Another call that they played as well, it was really strange. Scott had called Amber, and he had told her that he saw the press conference that she gave after she had gone forward to the police, and that he was really proud of her for going forward to the police and telling the police about their affair, and telling her that he was really proud of her for doing the right thing, and he was really proud of her that she was going to be a witness for the prosecution because she was doing what she believed was right. And he kept telling her like how brave she was. Next, the prosecution calls 2 experts to the stand. One was Dr. Brian Peterson, and the other was Dr. Allison Galloway. So Dr. Brian Peterson was a forensic pathologist, and Allison Galloway was a professor at UC Santa Cruz. So Dr. Peterson testified about the conditions of the bodies, specifically the condition of Lacey Peterson's body, and how only a torso was found, and that the head and all 4 limbs were missing. He also said all of the organs besides the uterus was missing, and he also said like the skin and the soft tissue above the navel was also missing. And I'm going to read this because I am not a doctor, so I have to read off of this. He testified that the uterus was still expanded from the pregnancy, measuring roughly 10 inches, but that it was very thin, and that the top part was open, allowing for Connor to exit the body. He said that there was no placenta or umbilical cord inside of Lacey, and that the birth canal was closed. He also said that Lacey had fractures, had a bunch of rib fractures, but that there was no indication of a C-section along her abdomen. Dr. Allison Galloway, she testified that she believed through her calculations that Lacey's body had been inside of the water for anywhere between 3 to 6 months. She said that Connor's body seemed to be way more protected and in significantly better condition. Although the body was translucent, that it was significantly more protected than Lacey's body was from the marine life. And that from her measurements, she was able to gauge that the gestational age for Connor was between 33 to 38 weeks. The prosecution then called Dr. Ralph Cheng to the stand. He is a research hydrologist. He came to testify basically about how Connor could have no longer been inside of Lacey's body if she had died when she was 8.5 months pregnant and she had not given birth yet. And he also came to testify about how Connor's body could have been found a mile away from where Lacey's body was found. All right. So he testified further that he was actually reached out to in February of 2003, way before Lacey's body had washed up ashore. And he was reached out to in order to help determine where would Lacey's body be found, or where would Lacey's body have been dumped at? Where would Lacey's body currently be under the water? And he was supposed to be trying to analyze this off of the assumption that Scott had dumped her body in the water near the tip of Brooks Island using 4 to 5 8-pound anchor, so a total of 32 to 40 pounds on a 153-pound, 5'2" pregnant woman. And the theory that he testified to was that although Lacey's body was anchored to the bottom of the bay, the current of the water in the Berkeley Bay had expelled the unborn child, like out of her uterus, out of her birth canal, and out of her vagina. And that from there, from being dispelled out of her body, the current then took Connor and washed him up ashore. And he testified that he thinks that the storm that had occurred on April 12th was the reason why Connor's body had washed up ashore. And the reason why he said he believes that Lacey's body had washed up ashore is that he believes that due to the current and being in the water for so long, he thinks that the 8-pound weight on, she had an 8-pound weight on one hand, an 8-pound weight on the other one, and then 8-pound on her left leg and 8-pound on her right leg. He believed that these anchors plus the current plus the water had caused her limbs to have ripped off, including her head. That's why they thought there may have been an anchor around her head as well, because it would have caused her head to rip off, therefore only taking the torso part of her body into the water to be washed up ashore. And he said that once all of her limbs were ripped off, this is why she had absolutely no organs inside of her body besides her uterus. He said that because the limbs were ripped off, this allowed rooms for the organs to just leave the body. On cross-examination, though, Dr. Cheng testified that he actually has absolutely no expertise in this area. He has conducted no studies on it. He's had no education on it. He has done no investigation, no research, nothing. That he actually didn't really know anything about what he was testifying about. All this was just theoretical guessing. All right, so now it's the defense's turn to put on their case, and most of their case was actually put on through cross-examination of the state's witnesses. But there are some key witnesses and some key things to bring up. The first thing to bring up is that in the defense's opening statements, they said they were going to bring like 11 to 13 eyewitnesses forward that was able to place Lacey and their dog like walking in this loop, right? And they didn't call a single witness. And that's a big thing, because I'm letting you know, when you say things to the jury in opening statements, they're writing it down. And they're like mentally like, okay, I'm waiting for that. You know, and many jurors did give interviews later saying they were waiting for these witnesses that the defense never brought up. So, like, what happened? You know, why wouldn't you call, if these witnesses are so important and they're going to prove that Lacey was alive, why wouldn't you have called them up? Like, did you believe that they were unimportant just like the police believed they were unimportant? And the defense later came out in an interview and kind of explained why they didn't call forward those witnesses. And the reason why this is important was because there's many appeals that are going on, even currently, saying that this was ineffective assistance of counsel to have not called forward those witnesses that would have proved that Lacey was alive when Scott was in the marina. And so the defense attorney said that at the time they decided not to do it because the prosecution had a rebuttal witness that they were going to put on if the defense called these witnesses. And that rebuttal witness was somebody that was going to say that they saw Mackenzie, the dog, walking itself without an owner and its leash just dragging around like 10:15, 10:18 in the morning. And that completely like kind of botched the defense's timeline with these 13 other witnesses. And so they were nervous that on cross-examination, because these witnesses couldn't have their timeline maybe down perfectly in accordance with this rebuttal witness, that it just would have looked too bad to the jury and the jury wouldn't have believed their 13 witnesses. So instead, what they did was they called forward, like there was a bunch of women that were called forward that looked somewhat similar to Laci, that were pregnant or that were like heavier weight and had dogs. And they all said upon testimony, no, I was not walking my dog at the time. Like it was literally like a long string of women that were called to the stand and they all said, no, I wasn't walking my dog. So I guess the defense thought that was enough to substitute the actual eyewitnesses. So now let's get into the defense's expert witnesses. And I think these were the main vital people and witnesses to talk about for the defense's case. Because again, in my theory, and I agree with the defense and I agree with legal experts, the defense here made most of their case on cross-examination. They were able to get the police to admit numerous times that they were lying and that they had lied in their police reports, they had lied in affidavits, they had redacted multiple statements, they didn't follow up on any leads, they lied to the press. In fact, so much so that there was a part in the trial where the judge had excused all of the witnesses and excused all of the jury members, and he had called the captain of like the police department up to the stand and like reprimanded the shit out of Modesto Police Department because they were violating a gag order. The judge had ordered that the police were no longer allowed to talk to the press about this case. And what had happened was that Brochini, whatever his name is, that him and a few other Modesto police officers, they actually were leaking information to the press about the trial because the trial wasn't allowed to be filmed. And they were also not only leaking information and leaking statements and giving statements to the press, but they had also given them fake images. They had given them fake images of like a bleach spill, and they had given them fake images of something else. I can't remember what it was. But they had leaked these fake images to the press. And so the judge had called the captain, I think it was Captain AJ or something like that, or AJA, Captain AJA. And he was like reprimanded and was like, look, your police department needs to shut the fuck up. You guys are violating a gag order. Okay, so like I agree that they had made most of their case through the cross-examination of the prosecution witnesses, but I don't think they made it enough to have not called those 13 witnesses. Okay, so let's get into the two main witnesses that we're going to talk about. They're expert witnesses. So they called expert witnesses to discredit the state's expert witnesses. Specifically, Dr. Cheng's testimony is what they really went hard at. The defense's expert said that the entire testimony of Dr. Cheng was inaccurate and it wasn't based on science. That nothing in Dr. Cheng's testimony had anything to do that was based off of studies, that was based off of science, that was based off of like empirical research or education, and that Dr. Cheng was not even qualified to be discussing these topics or analyzing things of this nature either. He said that he not only specifically has a doctoral degree in this, but that also he has tested along with his crew, his people, his work, that they have tested bodies underwater for years. And that fish and animals, they don't chew at ligaments and they don't chew at bones, which is what Dr. Cheng was trying to say, was that one of the reasons too that the limbs were able to just rip apart because of these 8-pound anchors was also because the fish were eating away at the human bone and the human ligaments in order to like help break that barrier to free the torso. And he was saying that this is not true. They do thousands of studies and this has never happened. He also said that organs cannot just disintegrate or they can't also just like leave the body and float off. Like, unless they were like ripped open, like the torso was just ripped open and the body was ripped open to where the organs could maybe come out, but they don't disintegrate and they don't just like float off and out of the body. So then Dr. Charles March was also called to the stand. He was an OBGYN and he was also the expert witness that they chose to use, even though he had absolutely no experience testifying. Which is a really big deal because testifying, especially in a murder case, the district attorney is going to go really hard at you. And if you've never been cross-examined, you're not going to do well at it, right? You're going to hate every second of your life up there and you're going to do really bad. So, but on direct examination, he did great. On direct examination, he testified that Connor's body was in really good shape. And after analyzing the body and conducting research on the body and all of these things and doing forensic testing on the body as well, he determined that the earliest date of death for Connor would be December 29th. So then he said it would be impossible for the baby to have died on December 23rd or December 24th. He also further discussed that when Connor's body was found, there was this twine that was wrapped around his neck. And it was pinning, like, and taping Connor's ears back, like the twine was. And he was saying that this twine could have had the possibility of insinuating that Connor's body had been dealt with after death. He also criticized the state's expert witness who said that the date of death for Lacey and Connor was both December 24th. He said that this testing was completely flawed and that it not only wasn't analyzed properly, but that the testing itself wasn't done properly either. And everything was going great. In fact, many legal analysts and the news all basically said after this doctor's testimony, everyone thought the trial was going in the favor of Scott Peterson, that it had really taken a turn for the defense until this doctor, Charles March, got cross-examined. And he had never testified before and he had completely lost it to the point where like he was like running his hands through his hair, huffing and puffing. He like threw his glasses down and he kept getting frustrated that the state was trying to undermine him. And the other thing that's really frustrating about cross-examination is you don't have the ability to explain yourself. So it's just like yes or no answers. Like if I try to explain myself, if I said, and so back in 2000, like back in 1999, you were examined by the medical board for misconduct. Isn't that correct? And you'd be like, yes, but no, objection. And they would strike everything after yes. And you'd be like, can I explain? And I would tell you, no, you cannot explain. So that's where it gets frustrating, is that you don't get an opportunity to explain all of the undermining that the cross-examining attorney is doing to you and making you look like either you're a hack, you're an idiot, you're a liar, you're not trustworthy, whatever it is. So he got really frustrated and he like threw his glasses and he said, why don't you let me explain? Just give me a break here. I've never testified before. And so after his cross-examination, the defense did not call him back to the stand. They just wanted him out there as soon as possible. And basically, everything he testified to on direct had just been like kind of washed down the drain for how he acted on cross. Now we will get into the closing argument. So the district attorney at this point had kind of changed their theory and they were trying to do some backpedaling and they were basically now being like, okay, yeah, I understand it that the police completely botched this investigation and the police lied a lot and they were trying to redact things out of their statements and they didn't follow up on any leads. And so the reason why we don't have answers for you is because the police messed up. But even though the police messed up, we don't know if Lacey died on the 23rd or the 24th, but we know she died. And we don't know how she died. We don't know if she was strangled, if she was suffocated with a pillow. We don't know if it was blunt force trauma. Like, we don't know what happened, but we know she died. We don't know when, where, how, but we know she died, and we know that Scott did it. And they said that although there was no forensic evidence that pointed to Scott, all what the jury needed to do was use their common sense. And that with their common sense, they would be able to see that Scott didn't want the responsibilities of being a father and being a husband anymore. And that he wanted to live this carefree life with Amber, and he wanted to be the single man with no responsibilities. Like, why else would he have traded in Lacey's car before her body was ever found and got himself like this nice new truck? Why would he have been looking into buying a brand new home, like outside of Modesto, not even in Modesto, and selling their family home, him and Lacey's family home, if Lacey's only missing and not dead, right? And it was because he had been planning this for a long time. He had been planning this move to get out of here and get out of the situation that he was in. And then they put up a picture of Lacey Peterson in this red dress, pregnant, sitting on a chair, holding her belly. And it was the evening of the Christmas party at her family's house when he had told her that he had to go to work for his boss in San Francisco. And then next to it, they put up a picture of Scott in this Santa hat that same evening with Amber at her Christmas party, with Amber all nuzzled up into his neck. The defense's closing arguments were really done rather lacklusterly. I read the transcripts. I've also read what other people have thought about his closing arguments, and they were done very badly. It was described as he was having a bad day, or he was having an off day, or maybe he was tired, but it was very flat. And basically all what he said was that they honed in on the fact that the state had absolutely no evidence, like no forensic evidence. They spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on this forensic testing. Nothing came up. Nothing was found in the home, in the warehouse. There was no anchors that were found. In this very thorough search with all this crazy technology, no anchors were found. The rest of Lacey's remains were never found. They never followed up on the 13 eyewitnesses. They never followed up on the police officer that said he saw a woman matching Lacey's description being forced into a van, and that there was just all this reasonable doubt. So during deliberations, before we get to the verdict, this was also really important. During deliberations, 2 more jury members were dismissed before they were able to reach a verdict. So one juror admitted that she did her own investigation, which you are not allowed to do. You are only allowed to take what is presented to you at trial, and that's the only information you can work off of. You can't work off of, if you are a nurse or a doctor, you can't work off of like all of this prior medical knowledge about Lacey's body, right? And who, like, you can't work off of that knowledge. You can only work off of what the expert said to you and what the lawyer said to you, like the evidence that was presented. But this juror admitted that she heard the district attorney say something that not only she didn't believe, but she knew that it wasn't true. And she just wanted to double check. She felt like the stakes were so high. So she like went and did her own investigation and looked it up and found out that the district attorney was in fact incorrect. And the district attorney was not telling the truth. And so because of that, she was more pro-defense, because we don't find out what it was that she looked up, but we just found, all what we know was that she said that she had looked up a bit of evidence that basically, like, in her opinion, had completely blown up the DA's case and made her go for the defense. So she was dismissed and an alternate was brought in, because you cannot commit your own research and investigation. Then there was the next juror that was dismissed. His name was Gregory, and he was the jury foreman. And Gregory was a doctor and a lawyer. And he took like stacks of notes. Like the jurors were saying, like he had hundreds and hundreds of pages of notes because this trial was 5 months long. And it was said, what they were saying was that he was the only juror that was like really pro-innocent that was left. And all of the other jurors, like that they had walked in there and they all just went, he's guilty, right? And this juror was like, no, that's not how this works. We have to go through every bit of evidence and let me show you, let me tell you, like, let me walk you through, like, what beyond a reasonable doubt means, how high the burden of proof is. Let me explain to you, like, what circumstantial evidence means. Like, let me explain to you, like, you know, if you can come down to two reasonable conclusions, right, then you have to go with not guilty. And so he kept having the other jury members go through every single bit of evidence, like step by step, for the entire 5-month trial. And there was this one jury, and like all the jury members were getting really frustrated, but there was this one jury member in particular that not only got unbelievably frustrated, but he had physically threatened Mr. Jackson's life. Like, he had like put his hands on him and like threw him up against the wall and was screaming and threatening him and threatening his life, and said something along the lines of like, I hope you die like Lacey and Connor. So something like that. That's what other juries have given interviews about, right? So Mr. Jackson went to the judge, explained what was happening, and he asked if he could please be excused off of the jury and go home. And so he was. Another alternate was brought in. After this other alternate was brought in, Scott Peterson was found guilty on both counts. First-degree murder of Lacey Peterson and second-degree murder of Connor Peterson. He was sentenced to death. His death sentence was overturned, and he was just given life without the possibility of parole. He has tried many avenues of litigation in order to get relief, in order to get out of prison, in order to get a new trial. He has remained his innocence since 2002, so 22 years now. And they have always been denied. The Los Angeles Innocence Project has picked up his case, and they have filed several motions. And this is what the new evidence basically says in their brief. And this isn't all of it, this is just a super brief portion that was released to the public. They said that a sheriff was going through the tip lines and found a tip from a Lieutenant Aponte. There was a recorded conversation between an inmate in Modesto and the inmate's brothers, who was friends with the men that burglarized the home next to the Petersons. When the brothers said that Lacey had confronted the burglars of her neighbors on the 24th, and then that they had threatened her life. After the brothers said that, the inmate yelled, "Shut up. This call could be taped." This Lieutenant Aponte told the Modesto Police Department apparently 2 weeks after Lacey had gone missing. And he has even told the Innocence Project that he called twice before to the Modesto Police Department and they just never called him back. And he stated that he gave a copy of this tape to the Modesto Police Department, but they say that they don't have the tape. Other evidence that is coming up is that the LA Innocence Project alleges that there was grave prosecutorial error, significant amount of Brady violations, which is violating Brady v. Maryland, that the police and the district attorneys not only were hiding and concealing evidence, and evidence that they did not turn over to the defense, and that they had tried to quote-unquote surgically cut out. They also claimed that there was not only grave prosecutorial miserror, but there was also ineffective assistance of counsel by not calling the witnesses, the 13 witnesses that saw Lacey alive after Scott had already left the marina. Therefore proving in their mind, allegedly proving that Lacey could have been alive at that time that Scott was at the marina, therefore he couldn't have done it. So they're claiming IAC in regards to that. And then in their court filings, they refer to the witness as DM. They're not going to give away his name or her name, but DM. And this witness allegedly has come forward and said that he too robbed the house next to the Petersons' home, and that he took part in Lacey's abduction after she had caught them mid-crime. So they're alleging that there's a witness by the initials of DM who has come forward now and said, hey, I was part of the burglary that happened across the street from Lacey Peterson. She caught us mid-crime and I helped in abducting her. The LA Innocence Project is also asking for DNA testing of a glove and hammer that the robbers are believed to have left behind, as well as DNA testing on cloth from a blood-stained mattress found in a burned-out van parked in the vicinity of the Peterson home. So we don't know, and we won't know for a while, where it's going to go with the Innocence Project. We don't know if the court is going to grant it or not. Writs of habeas corpus based on actual innocence take a very, very, very long time. They take a couple of years to go forward. Not only do you have to prove a prima facie case, but after you prove a prima facie case, which is quite easy to prove, but after you prove a prima facie case, you would have to go forward then and get past an OSC hearing in order to show cause. After you get past an OSC hearing in order to show cause, which is significantly more difficult, a prima facie case, all what you have to do essentially is the judge has to take what you are alleging as true, right? And for anything, if I said in there, I'm completely innocent, I'm a framed person, the prima facie case you have to take as inherently true, but you are allowed to look back on court records in order to kind of validify what they're saying in their petition. And then after the petition meets the prima facie hearing, you would go to an OSC in order to show cause hearing. Once you can get the order to show cause hearing, you can go forward to a full-blown evidentiary trial in front of a judge, and you can call all of your witnesses and do the damn thing. And I'm pretty sure they're going to be arguing writ of habeas corpus based on actual innocence. So we will see how that plays out. But until then, until we get the update of the current status of Scott Peterson's legal woes, that is all what I have for you today. I hope you learned something. And with that, the defense rests.